U.S., Japan was the number 2 buyer of U.S. debt, and we're, of course, wonderful trading partners with Japan. It would have been advantageous to the Chinese because they're the number 1 buyers of U.S. debt, and they're up and coming strong, and they want to compete in several markets, not the least of which is electronics and manufactured goods and pre-manufactured goods, and their HARP is located not very far away, and they are already suspected of targeting Japan, not actually firing them, but targeting them with missiles. So there is intent, there is opportunity, and there is capability. Those are 3 good earmarks for any investigator. Russia, on the other hand, also has some motivation to do it because they are not really the friends that the Clintons would have us believe they are with the West. The West, however, probably was not involved in it. Now, the other HARPs do have signatures as well. The one in Russia is nicknamed the Woodpecker because its ELF is so high amplitude that it makes a very loud ticking sound on the ham radio when it's picked up. No evidence that that one was picked up. Huh. So that only leaves the Chinese one left.
And I'm also told, Brooks, that the one in Alaska is no longer owned by us. It's owned by some other company outside of the United States. Is that true?
I'm not aware of that. I really am not. The government does some strange things with its assets and moves them around. When we built a scale model of the HARP cloud chamber, and I actually produced it for Jesse Ventura's first program in his series called Conspiracy Theories. So we did one on weather warfare, and we built a scale model, demonstrated it on TV, and showed people how a cloud could be moved. Now, we didn't have enough time to do the earthquake segment like we did with the History Channel 6 or 7 months before that, but it was still pretty dramatic. It was, 1.7 million viewers that first night of that episode. So, lots of people are aware that this capability is out there.
Why would someone want to manipulate the weather?
Oh, that's a really great question. History is replete with civilizations being delivered by the hand of God, not the least of which is the Spanish Armada being sunk in the English Channel as they were sailing up to attack Britain. I'm sure the British were quite happy that God had stepped in with typically harsh weather in the English Channel and sunk those ships. What a wonderful thing it would be to be able to command the hand of God to just come in and smack your enemy with particularly bad weather. And besides, there are no fingerprints. Surely you must be joking, they would say in the news release. You think we could manipulate the weather? Are you kidding? Bad luck for you. It's the perfect weapon, George. It has no fingerprints. It is an act of God that comes in and directs a hurricane into your path, or starves you out of rain for a couple of years, or causes a summer of heat so bad that your wheat cooks into dust in the middle of the field. It's the perfect weapon. Of course they would want to develop it.
And it is so secretive, yet we pick up little bits and pieces as we've been talking about.
Well, the former governor, he's a great guy. He's imposing. He doesn't take any crap off anybody. When he went up there to the HARP facility, and they would not let him pass that fence for a tour, he was not happy. That was a really tense moment for him. I thought they were going to have to cut the film and get the Band-Aids out because it was going to get rough. He didn't like that one bit. You're exactly right, George. There are secrets behind that fence, and the public knows nothing. There is no civilian oversight of this weapons system, and that's the danger.
How do we know here in the United States that they've turned HARP on in Alaska? Do we have any idea? Are there things we can see?
Well, yes, there are auroras that will happen in very strange places, like as far south as Charlotte. That would not be something ordinary. Maybe down into Wisconsin, but an aurora would not appear in equatorial climes unless it was artificially produced. It has. In Chile, right before the quake. In Haiti, right before the quake. There was the telltale lavender sky that lights up just before these things happen. Now, I published that, and somebody wrote back and said, oh, that's nonsense. Every time there's an earthquake, a major quake, the sky does that because the Earth puts off these frequencies. And I immediately wrote back. I said, you're kidding. This would be amazing. We have the best earthquake detector we could ever ask for. All we have to do is watch the sky. And when it turns lavender like that, we know a big quake's coming, evacuate the city. Truth is, it doesn't happen.
Let's go back to the Roseburg, Oregon situation. Were you in shock when you figured out that you were doing this, or at least participating in it?
Yeah, okay. I was. That day we were on contract, of course, and on a schedule, and everybody has to, feed their families, so we were staying with it. But in retrospect, we were going back and writing up the report. I was a little tenuous at that point. I said, guys, we could have triggered something. Maybe we should be careful in geotechnically active areas, like here in the overthrust area of the Northwest. We should be careful with how much power we're using and how we're directing this. We don't want to trigger anything, and when they come with the helicopters to find out what happened, here we are in our four-wheel drive van and our little ATV. We're the only culprits. We would be seen as geological terrorists. So it's definitely frightening to think of the consequences.
50 watts, it's less than most of my light bulbs.
Well, that's true, but you see, that's the beauty of Tesla's resonance theory. It doesn't take very much energy. It just takes exactly the right amount of energy at exactly the right frequency. It constructively interferes with itself, like playing tetherball, or like building upon the same sound wave over and over again, like when you're in a room that you get a standing wave in. That's the beauty of how this works. When you create a wavelength that's exactly the right length, very small amounts of power can be very effective.
Do you believe that as this technology gets further developed, that governments will use it for very evil purposes?
Well, as I said in the first segment, I'm not much of a believer in anything. I look for evidence, and I can tell you, George, I'm a history buff. I read about it, I studied, I look for trends and patterns. I can almost guarantee that if the capability is there, they will use it, and they will develop it to its most strategic advantage.
Exactly. Talk about the solar tap again for me. What's it?
Wow. Oh, the solar tap. If you go out during a thunderstorm, and we had a doozy here in southern Mississippi today, you'll see thunder clouds form, and everybody's seen these from a distance. The big head goes up 50,000 feet in the air, and the air begins moving up and down, and then it creates a static charge. An ion path will open between the bottom of that cloud and the ground. And as the ion path opens from the ground up to the cloud, it allows electrons to discharge that have built up as static charge in that cloud down to the ground. Now, that lightning bolt's typically only about the size of your arm, but it appears very bright. Of course, as it vaporizes the air in its path and the air comes back together, then you get the clap of thunder. Well, that's a pretty devastating multi-million volt event. But at the end of the day, we're only talking a jump of maybe 2,000 to 5,000 feet to the ground. A solar tap is something quite a bit larger. The ionosphere sits around the Earth like a giant soap bubble. It not only protects us from cosmic radiation, it absorbs a lot. It takes a lot of the atomic hits, the proton hits for us, and deflects them and creates cosmic rays, which are much more benign for those of us living on the surface of our planet. But that ionosphere is huge and contains a tremendous amount of energy, and it's incalculable how much energy it contains. It's also a safe distance away from the ground, the Earth. But when you fire HARP, you are creating like a microwave ground wire that goes from the ground up to the ionosphere. If that wavelength gets just right, and the energy in the ionosphere gets just right, maybe a solar flare is charging it up at the moment, a solar wind is particularly strong, you create that ion path between the ionosphere and ground, and now you have not a 2 or 3, 4,000 foot lightning bolt. You have a 40-kilometer lightning bolt. And it isn't the diameter of your arm. It's about a kilometer in diameter. Now, when I did the calculations, this thing should pulse, if it ever did happen, and I hope it never does, it should pulse at about the same frequency that a lightning bolt pulses at, somewhere between 18 and 35 pulses per second. You can see it with the naked eye. When you see a lightning bolt fire, it usually fires about 20 or 30 or 40 times in the same spot. All the electrons dump out of the cloud, the potential drops below the resistance, and the lightning bolt stops. But that's in a cloud, a very small atmospheric structure. The ionosphere is huge. It's bigger than the Earth itself. And if it starts to discharge to the planet itself, it won't stop. It will continue. And if it pulses at that rate, we're talking about 50 Mount St. Helens per second for about 2 or 3 minutes.
Well, how do we know that HARP, for example, isn't being turned on almost on a regular basis in just bombarding the ionosphere?
Well, we do have some watchdogs out there that have ham radios. They're tuned to the HARP wavelengths, which are in the 2-meter band, somewhere between 144 megahertz and 152 megahertz.
And what do they hear if it's turned on?
They will hear what's called a constant wave signal. It's kind of like a white noise. There won't be a music come over it like...
it static? Does it sound like static?
It sounds like static, but it's much cleaner than that because it's a very controlled frequency. You'll see it on your power meters, and ham operators will know what they're looking for. But it's not going to be something audio. It's going to be something in the electrical range that you can measure with an RF meter. When that happens, when those needles go up, and believe me, you won't have any trouble picking it up because this is now a billion-watt signal, then you start listening for the ELF, VLF, and ULF signals that go on top of it. Now, these will probably be encrypted information, like rapid-fire Morse code, but nevertheless, the amplitude will be there, and you should be able to pick it up if you're in the target area of those waves.
What would happen to the ozone layer if it got bombarded as well?
Well, actually, one of the claims of the project is that it would rebuild the ozone layer, that if they used it just right, it would create that O3 ion, which is the actual complex for ozone, by charging up those oxygen atoms and allowing them to come together as that very reactive O3 molecule that reacts with the UV as it comes into the atmosphere. The risk is that if a solar tap occurs, all that potential is discharged. So the ozone layer would actually be completely destroyed, and it would take probably 25 years for it to rebuild through natural means.
Huh. That could be damaging.
Well, yes. Then if we had a particularly strong solar activity, lots of protons hitting the planet, lots of UV, some coronal mass ejections or solar flares, there's nothing to stop it from reaching the surface. It would literally sterilize the surface of the planet. We'd be like Mars, but for a short period of time. And believe me, if you kill off the bacteria, you begin to kill off man. Because you're beginning at the very basic levels of the food chain, and you're dimerizing. That is to say, you're splitting apart genetic material and not allowing it to reproduce.
If some people just don't feel right, they feel weird, strange, is it possible that they're picking up something from HARP?
Yeah, it is possible, and this will be more widespread. You can pick this up by looking at police reports of anxiety, of people not sleeping for days at a time, and crime going up, especially domestic crime, because you become tense and irritable and sleepless, and you have nightmares. And sometimes patients, especially under Nick Begich's observations, can even hear voices. They can hear messages like God speaking to them. And I can tell you that if the government's doing these kinds of experiments, they would put these messages into there. And when it was used in the early 90s in the first Gulf War, it was crude, but it was effective in upsetting the ability of the soldiers to stand and fight. And these were trained, battle-hardened troops. They came out of those bunkers like kids.
Brooks, it's hard to believe, but it's also believable, isn't it?
Well, it is, and I'm like I said, I'm not too much into believing conspiracy theories, but when I see the capabilities for myself and the scientific risks myself, and then I look at the historical track record of our own government, I think to myself, what government in their right mind would drop a thermonuclear device on a city with civilians in it? Well, there's the answer.
What's your website?
The best website to get everything would be x2radio.com. That's kind of my Sunday night treatise where I speak to the people about what I'm doing. But then there's visionmotorcars.com if they're interested in the electric vehicles, and of course rememberingthefuturebook.com for my latest book on resonance theory and self-help.
All right, Brooks, when we come back, I want to talk with you about the History Channel appearance that you made about a year ago, as you talked about HAARP as well. We'll get into that later on tonight. We'll take your phone calls with Brooks Agnew right here on Coast to Coast AM. Next hour, we'll take your phone calls with Dr. Brooks Agnew as we talk about his trek to the journey to the center of the earth and also HAARP and other technologies. That'll be next hour on Coast to Coast AM. And when we come right back, I've still got more to talk with him about. So we'll be right back. Don't touch that radio dial. Brooks, tell us about the History Channel show that you did on weather warfare, and what were they looking for? Because you demonstrated some things, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Actually, the producer was really, really great for the History Channel. They wanted to see if we could build a scale model and actually demonstrate for a viewer what it looks like to move a cloud or what it looks like to make HAARP work. So I, of course, had done almost 8 years of field work with what's now known as HAARP technology. In those days, we called it ground probing radar, because we used it to look for oil and gas in the ground, and it was, very successful in doing that.
Sure.
And the challenge was to build something that was both visual and functional and safe. So we ended up building a pretty large acrylic cloud chamber, and we used an ultrasonic nebulizer to actually make the cloud. So we didn't use steam. We actually used cold vapor using a high-frequency vibrator to push little micro droplets into the air. That's how clouds are really made. And once we got the cloud made in the chamber and it was nice and stable, I had the HAARP scale model phased array in the bottom. And I think we used between 8 and 30 hertz laced onto the frequency. We shined some lasers through the clouds so that you could actually see the turbulence occurring inside. They zoomed in on it with high-speed film. We turned it on, and within 5 seconds, that cloud was gone. And when we slowed the film down, it was really dramatic. So when that episode aired, that really put the government on notice that people now know that HAARP can move clouds, and millions of people saw it on television.
And you also demonstrated it for Jesse Ventura, didn't you?
Yeah, some of their team, June Sarpong was a great interviewer that was working on the team with conspiracy theory, and it was in Burbank, so I took the equipment over to their studio, set it back up, and did it again, repeated it again for their cameras. And it was nice to see that it was repeatable. That's always great when you set up an experiment and it works twice instead of just in one area in Santa Monica. But it was also a very highly viewed program. I think it was much more popular because of the star power of Jesse Ventura and his great persona.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of a natural, government buster anyway. And this was a subject that when it fell into the subject box, they decided to make it the debut episode, and it just happened to be the most watched episode of Conspiracy Theories. And the interview team did a great job. The experiment worked really well, and it was a super visual effect the way we backlighted it. And people got to see, practically how HARP works. Instead of reading about it on the internet, they could actually see it work for themselves.
I would assume that Jesse probably didn't even know what HARP was until this program or until the researchers and you and Begich showed up on the scene. Do you think he's a believer now?
Yeah, I think he's a believer. He did something that I haven't done. I'm sure Nick or his people, his group in Alaska have done. He went there. He went to the gates and tried to gain access, and he tried to use his ability as a former governor and a very public person and being on camera. And when a guy almost as big as he was came out to the gate and said, "Jesse, you're not coming in," and that was a very tense moment.
Well, yeah, it sure was. And back he went, but he wasn't too happy about it, was he?
No, he wasn't.
You have talked about a lavender haze that seems to be over certain earthquake spots, but you also talk about it in terms of HARP. So explain that.
Well, this is where HARP kind of gets its primary name, the high-frequency active auroral, because when they fire this thing off, it has so much power, it dumps up into the ionosphere, that the ions up there have no choice but to start dumping that energy. And they do it by the electrons jumping up the higher energy states and then dropping down to low energy states. And when they do, they give off a photon of light. That light is what we see as auroras. Typically, it's done by a combination of solar wind and energy and earth magnetism. And so we see it in the northern climes and southern climes. Well, we wouldn't see it in the equator because that's where the magnetism of Earth is most concentrated. And there's kind of a magnetic electrode jet from the Earth that goes up and spreads out over the magnetosphere of the Earth, which contributes to that ionization effect as well. But the HARP is an artificial version of that. It pumps a very finely tuned frequency up into that ionosphere. And so thus it is artificial. It is shall I say, more stimulative in a targeted way to the ionosphere than, say, would be solar wind or even galactic frequencies that are now coming into our solar system. We also, when we see HARP fired off, it's aimed using charges on the phased array further south. And so when we see a lavender haze over Haiti before the quake, over Chile before their big quake, we get very suspicious because auroras don't appear in these southern climes. We know it's artificial. We also know that the wavelength of light is more toward the purple band, which means it's a much shorter wavelength, much higher frequency than the greens or yellows or even reds that you would see in the northern climes, which are much longer wavelengths, more typical with solar radiation. And that's why we see these fingerprints hours, sometimes minutes before these quakes occur.
What would the motivation be, Brooks, to fire that machinery up and create an earthquake?
Well, that's a good question. Economic, sometimes experimental. When you follow the money, you get a much clearer explanation of what's going on. We know that the United States foreign policies have not made us very popular in different areas of the world. We it's not that we're bad guys. We're a great people and we're trying to do great things for the planet. But there are certain aspects of our government down at what I call the Department of War's R Us that are constantly keeping things in turmoil and more pushing toward what they call the interests of the United States, which is a more imperial viewpoint than, say, what states or even citizens of the United States would take.
The The creation of these earthquakes, which, they've occurred. Now, the question is, was it natural or was it forced by man for whatever reason? Massive deaths, lots of damage. Could it be used as a political tool as well to simply say, look at what we can do? Anytime, any place.
Well, fortunately, that kind of cablegram has never been leaked. If that one ever gets leaked, then your suspicions are well-founded. But that being said, if the weapon system is capable, and it's been demonstrated in an area that's, maybe off to the side politically, then you go to the leadership and you say the darn thing works. And we know from history, from Harry Truman getting that exact same message from the Manhattan Project crew, it works. He couldn't get that bomb dropped fast enough. And it ended up changing the course of humanity.
Can they manipulate a hurricane with HARP?
Well, I don't know that they could take over the energy system of a hurricane once it started, but moving the stratosphere around by pushing the ionosphere out ahead of the hurricane, ahead of the path of the hurricane, makes the jet stream move in that direction. I would say that they could not resist the temptation to steer a hurricane where they wanted it to go.
What can we do to try to make this safer for people?
Well, that's really the greatest question that Nick and I have been trying to answer for 14 years, and that is we need civilian oversight. We need scientists and the engineers that have experience with this in the field, both politically and from an engineering standpoint, to offer oversight or offer some kind of contribution to it so that they're aware of the risks, they're aware of the people's concerns for these risks, and maybe be more wise before they push the green button.
Maybe. What do you think they're still doing with HARP? Are they perfecting it? Can they get it even better?
Yeah, they are perfecting it, and they are pouring more money into it. And the website is getting even less informative. Years ago, they used to have lots of photographs and articles and even experiments that they were running and measurements that they were taking. You don't get any of that now. Now it's more of a tourist site, and a couple of times a year they have an open house when it's not running, of course. And you can come in and see what's going on. It's not like the other observatories that are paid for with tax dollars, like the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatories. You can go to those, and they'll show you everything, and you can photograph anything you want because it's paid for with taxpayer dollars, and it really is an observatory. But HARP is a different story. HARP is definitely has the capability and is being used as a weapons system.
What do you think would happen if we told people like Ron Paul, they've got to be aware of this, would they run with this?
It's hard to say. There is a level of government that appears to be higher than, or at least superior to what our elected officials can access. I spend a fair amount of time in Washington, as you may already guess, with the electric car business. It is the haves and the have-nots, as you talk about in your commercials. We have the major car makers who build cars, and they're powered by gasoline. The independent car makers that make electric vehicles have a much harder road to hoe. But we have an advantage, and that is that there are hundreds of thousands of customers that want our vehicles. That being said, we do get into political hot water in Washington as we lobby our case and try to get grant money and loan guarantees and different regulations set so that they're more friendly to electric vehicles instead of putting us in the internal combustion engine basket with everyone else. That being said as well, we see the ineffectiveness of congressmen at going over to departments and agencies which are run by the administration, the Department of Energy, the Department of Transportation. Congress is individually powerless in these areas. Now, when they get together as a group, they can do things if they happen to read the bill. But most of the time, they're really not treated with much respect in Washington. Outside of Washington, yes. Inside Washington, it's a completely different story. We see a government that's run by bureaucracies, that's run by agencies and departments, and those are run by secretaries and directors, which are not elected, but appointed.
What could be the biggest problem with HARP? If something would go wrong, beyond the manipulation, if something were to go wrong, Brooks, what could it be?
Well, besides triggering the propensity of an earthquake to happen when you want it to happen, I would say the worst thing that could happen would be the solar tap that we discussed earlier. This discharge of the ionosphere back down to Earth would be akin to a comet striking in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It could be, cataclysmic. To play with this system is just not responsible. That would be the biggest downside, is that all of a sudden you just have an industrial accident that makes a mild radiation leak into the Pacific Ocean look like a skinned knee.
How many people believe the story about HARP? What do you think?
Well, of course, I see a lot of mail. Every time there's an earthquake, I get tons of mail. Was HARP responsible? Was HARP responsible? And I always have to go out and do some investigation and make some phone calls. And I'm always hesitant to say, yes, HARP was involved. But I do ask the scientific questions. Were these telltale signs present? Were people watching for this and for this and for this? And when that evidence comes in, the haze in the sky, the ham signatures, the ELF almost audio signals that are picked up, if those occur hours or even days before the quake, I would say HARP was indirectly or even directly involved in triggering that earthquake. With respect to weather manipulation, we're beginning to see cloud patterns that we have never photographed before. They're almost like washboard skies layered upon each other. And when we begin messing with the balance of ecology, Mother Nature has a way of lashing back at it. And maybe we're seeing some of the backlash with this extreme weather that we're seeing.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Are we better off today with something like HARP out there or not?
Well, I would say yes, we're better off because we've learned what not to do. Now we just need to be wise enough to stop doing it.
Well, but are we?
That's hard to say. I can tell you that lots of money is being poured into it. It's definitely being upgraded. The facilities are being modernized every single year. And we're not talking small budgets here. We're talking multi-$100 million budgets.
Well, and they're always in denial. So are we going to get anybody to come forward besides the experts like you and Nick Begich and admit what the heck this thing is?
Some of the congressmen and women have begun to ask the questions. Sheila Jackson Lee, not the least of which, put the question to Donald Rumsfeld. What about this? Where is this money going? And Donald Rumsfeld, although not a long history at the Pentagon, was pretty open. And he said, we can't find the money. And we're not talking a small amount of money, George. We're talking a couple of $1 trillion.
I know. It's sickening, isn't it?
It really is. We really did well as a nation the last 10 years. We have been very productive, very innovative. Technology is doubling at an astonishing rate. And the economy is, strangely enough, is fairly resilient, even though unemployment is high and inflation seems to be creeping along behind it. What is really frustrating to those of us that are trying to gain access to capital is that we see multiple trillions of dollars being funneled to the biggest corporations in the world who already have all the money, and it's not as though they're making interest on it. Some of this money, $3.3 trillion, went out at almost 0% interest. And companies like General Motors and GE and Disney, and some of these companies didn't even need the money. And when you follow the money, you see, wait a minute, General Electric ended up with several $100 million in low-interest loans, and the next month the CEO of GE is made the head of economic recovery by President Obama. What's going on here? Isn't anyone else connecting the dots here? What frustrates us is this money is being pulled out of our economy, which we put there. We deserve to use it to stimulate our own economy and create those jobs by allowing small business to have access to that money to help offset the risk of starting up new businesses, because obviously we've lost a lot of our core businesses to exports and outsourcing. It's time to start building stuff again in this country.
If you had access to HARP and somebody was out there, what would you ask them? What's the thing you want to know about this thing?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I would want to see the records of when it was used, where it was targeted, because it's not accidental, and I would begin lining up those events with the natural events that have happened in those areas. And if they line up, it's time to shut it down.
Brooks, we're going to come back and take phone calls with you about the journey to the center of the earth and also HARP on Coast to Coast AM. Okay, this hour now, final hour, we'll take your phone calls with Dr. Brooks Agnew as we talk about the journey to the center of the earth, HARP, weather manipulation. That'll be all next on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. We've got Brooks Agnew with us. We're going to take your phone calls as well. Brooks, what other work are you working on these days beyond the car? I assume that takes up a lot of your time now, doesn't it?
It does. It takes up a lot of time. Of course, being a Six Sigma Master Black Belt, we are moving a lot of manufacturing around the country, consolidating things. Right now I'm on a contract down here in southern Mississippi helping a Fortune 100 company consolidate 2 manufacturing facilities to save a product, keep it here in this country. And it's a job, making things more efficient, eliminating waste. We have to be more competitive, and a lot of the things that we inherited in our manufacturing processes, it's just the way we've always done things isn't typically the best way to do things. So making those things more efficient, making it easier for people to do, making wages better for people, and also more competitive in the sense that the cost of goods sold drops for that individual item, and yet a person can make a decent living making it. So we're doing our best not to export jobs, but keeping them here in this country. And when I'm talking about jobs, at least from my standpoint, it's manufacturing jobs. We're not talking service-related jobs. We don't want to just be flipping hamburgers from coast to coast. We want to be building stuff because we're good at it.
We are good at it. We need to do more about it. Have you heard anything about any strange things going on at Antarctica?
Yes. As a matter of fact, Lake Vostok is about to be penetrated if it has not already. Now, the Antarctic winter has already begun, and we're talking minus 90 degrees. It's not easy to work down there. The small station that's down there houses less than 24 people. They don't want to drill all winter, but they are under a tremendous time crunch here because the drilling is not like an oil drill. It's like drilling with a beer can. You're trying to take ice cores. But now they're getting ready to break into the opening above Lake Vostok that has been created by this thermal energy heat that's down in that area that's melted some of the ice and pushed an opening and allow this lake to form. The really strange thing is as they flew over this with, as luck would have it, ground-probing radar to map it, they got a signal back that's very much like radioactive power supply, and that's definitely not what they expected to find. So now the Lake Vostok project has taken on a whole new slant, and I'm getting calls about that because of my expertise in various types of spectroscopy to understand some of the things, and not very much information is coming out of there, which makes it even more suspicious.
Okay, let's go to the phones. We'll pick it up by going to first-time caller Nicole in San Marcos, Texas, is up with us. Hey, Nicole, go ahead.
Hello. I really like this discussion tonight. But first, I want to say hello to my husband, who is working tonight, just like me. John Paul, by the way. I wanted to talk about you mentioned that hurricanes can be redirected. And I was living in Cabo for a couple of years, and at first, we had a couple of hurricanes that came by us, and people in the community would talk about how they knew that the states had went out there, and somewhere out in the Pacific, there was some kind of an object or something that was, redirecting the hurricane, because they had such a terrible hurricane a while back, and they didn't want it to happen again. So they went ahead and let people, I guess the United States, go out there and do this study, and they had mentioned that that there was it was being redirected. I didn't believe it at first, but we had a couple of hurricanes go out there between 2006, 2008, and they were nothing hit us. They would always go to La Paz, or they'd go to the mainland, but they would always go around Cabo. They'd always go around, Baja, or down in the San Jose, because it's such a tourist area. Yeah. They wanted to preserve it. So I do believe that it can be done.
Well, it probably can be done. And Brooks, one day we'll find out, won't we?
Yeah, we'll find out one day that maybe the records will be opened and we'll be able to see what's being done and where.
I wonder if there's anything, though, on WikiLeaks that we just haven't seen yet.
I do, too. I on my program, nominated Julian Assange for the Nobel Peace Prize because at least he's airing the dirty laundry. He didn't create the dirty laundry, but it's about time people see what's going on behind closed doors.
All right, next up, let's go to Daniel in Little Rock, Arkansas. Welcome to Coast, Daniel.
Thank you. It's an honor to be on with both of you and enjoy both programs that you were on, History Channel and the Jesse Ventura one.
Thank you.
It was amazing. We're just hearing a lot of different things here in Arkansas. The ground, not so much in March, but in January and for December, we had almost an earthquake every day. And then the weird oddity of the birds that fell out of the sky by the thousands, and their little bodies and insides have been pretty much turned to mush, and then the thousands of fish that came up in the rivers. And then I have a source, listen to Joyce Riley, and you've had her on the show, George. Sure. She reported in the last month that FEMA had ordered almost 400 million meals, as if they're preparing for something. Mm-hmm. So sources I have, 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, are saying they think the atmosphere is being supercharged for an earthquake on the New Madrid, that the government could declare martial law in the coming months. There's one other thing. There's a drill here May 21st in Arkansas. Homeland Security is having a drill for an earthquake, ironically, on the New Madrid fault line. Why would Homeland Security be having a drill that they're supposed to protect us from terrorism, and now they're preparing for an earthquake? I'm just wondering if any of you have heard that, and if we can get that information out there to hopefully stop it, should such insanity be possibly in the going.
Well, I've heard about the buying of the food, the storable food, and I didn't hear about the 4 million figure, but I heard it was pretty darn extensive. Brooks, I don't know if you heard that.
I did hear about the bulk buying of food, and this isn't just outdated food. This is a major move to create a storehouse of food. Now, I could tell you from past experience, because I was in the earthquake in 1969 in Selmar, California, that the movie was made on, by the way. And we were in Simi Valley at the time, and after a couple of days of no water and no ice and, smelling gas in the valley and things like that and hundreds of aftershocks, we were ready to get out of that valley. So we got into the car and we were going to drive out of the valley down to Santa Monica. The National Guard had us sealed in that valley. Now, they had also seized all of the grocery stores in the valley, and they were rationing out the food so that people didn't go in and clean out the stores like you saw happen in Japan. That kind of authority rests with the Red Cross. Within a 2-hour notice, they can shut down all distribution of food in any state.
That fast?
2-hour notice, and they practice it all the time. Now, the interesting thing about the New Madrid fault, a lot of people don't know this, but there was a terrible quake on that in the early 1800s that was so violent that the Mississippi River ran backwards, and it formed Reelfoot Lake.
Right.
Well, Mississippi River happens to have so many bridges crossing it, interstate bridges and local bridges. If those bridges fell, it would literally cut the transport of food in half in this nation.
Okay, he also wanted to know about, exercises for earthquakes. Wouldn't you say that's standard procedure?
Well, it used to be when I was a kid, we crawled under our desks, because we had earthquakes in Southern California all the time. But Arkansas, we're talking about one solid slab of limestone from the Mississippi Delta all the way to South Dakota. It's not a very tectonically active area. This isn't the Pacific Rim. I don't understand why.
No, but they do say, Brooks, that the New Madrid Fault, which Arkansas is part of, could be the biggest fault line in the country.
It is, but it's not very active. There's just not much movement on it.
So far. Keep our fingers crossed, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, next up, who's up? Let's go to Ruben in Milan, Michigan, east of the Rockies. Ruben, you're up.
Hey, George, how you doing?
Good, Rube. Thank you.
Hey, it's good that your last caller had the exact thought that I was having. About the millions of food packs that they bought, and how they're getting ready for something. Wouldn't you think? And this is an off the wall thing. I know some people don't think Obama needs help winning the elections and things like that, but wouldn't at the right time, something off the wall, wouldn't it at the right a big thing happening at the right time? Wouldn't you have to call off elections for a while to make sure everything is, until the country gets back to where it's, I don't know, ticking again at a...
that could happen. That's the same thing everybody thought George Bush would do. Remember? They thought some major event would crush the election and he'd stay in office. And, it's part of the conspiracy, I think. It's out there. God forbid anything happens, Brooks.
Well, my time in Washington, I can tell you the president's a powerful man, but there are forces that, not forces, but there are organizational powers that really control things at a much higher level than the president. Even the president is either not aware of it or ineffectual at doing anything about it.
Are you sensing that anything is out there, that anything can happen?
Well, define sensing. I'm a person of data, and I look for patterns and mathematical, at least some metric, some measurable thing. And yes, I do see trends. I see not just the average that's shifting slightly in the world, but the extremes on either end. The minimums and maximums are unbelievable. 100-degree plus temperature swings in a single 24-hour period.
Yeah, that was pretty extensive. Next up, we go to Middleton, Wisconsin. Hey, John, welcome to the program. You're up with us.
Yes, thank you for taking my call. In our blog, we also recommended Assange for the Nobel Prize. We also recommend that the government stop torturing Bradley Manning, as P.J. Crowley, former State Department official, also has requested. In Google, type Phoenix, F-I-N-N-I-C-S, and the number 7. My question is Rahm Emanuel, Israel's secret police, Mossad, he's in it, he's a dual citizen, and the Qatarian Zionists in New York Wall Street and Federal Reserve and Chicago Board of Exchange and Chicago Commodity Exchange, are they running America? Have we had a silent coup? How do you answer?
Wow, I really don't know about a silent coup. I think if there has been a coup d'état in the United States, it has taken place on an economic level that would stagger the founding fathers. We have seen our government, or at least the agencies of our government, or at least the Fed, writing checks that they just can't possibly cover. And there's only one of two reasons why anybody, any government would do that. One is they never expect to have to make the check good, and the other is they're expecting some kind of windfall that'll come in so they can beat the check to the bank. I honestly don't think the latter is happening.
I had a guest a couple of weeks ago, and he said that this is beyond specific groups, targeted groups. These are globalists at a major scale that are out to upend the United States any way they can in order to balance the power. And you know what? The way we see things unfold, Brooks, he might be right.
Well, I don't know on those political levels. I know that if you're going to take over the world now, it isn't going to be with uniforms and machines. It's going to be with ones and zeros.
That's absolutely right. Next up, we go to Diana in Cleveland, Ohio. You're on Coast to Coast. Hello, Diana.
Hi, actually it's Anna, but that's okay.
Anna, okay. It is what my screen says, but no.
Yeah, I know. Yes, I have a couple of questions. I'd like to relate the incident that's been happening weather-wise here. Last week we had 5 days of sunshine in a row. I was up early in the morning at sunrise, and they were going absolutely nuts with the chemtrails. There were planes flying over two at a time next to each other at sunrise and producing the clouds, which I don't think there would have been clouds had the planes not been up. And I was wondering if there was a relationship between HAARP and the chemtrails, or with the lack of clouds, that they needed to create clouds.
Well, that is one of the aspects of HAARP, is that it can be used as a frequency activator for either aerosols, which are like chemtrails would be, or for biological warfare. These are either viral or biological agents that are put into the battlefield, and the design is that these are activated by certain frequencies that are broadcast into that field. So everyone is going to get infected, as you will, or covered, if you will, but if you move out of the target area and you're able to target these frequencies in a certain area, then those agents are activated to be particularly virulent, and thus you spare your forces and only influence the forces that you want to have activated. It's really not out of the range of technology. The real question is, what are chemtrails? Why are they being dropped over civilians? And what's the plan? Who's in charge of it? I didn't really know much about it until I met Jonathan Elenoff and some others, and they showed me some photographs of, because I do a lot of flying, and I can tell you, nobody lets anybody put anything in Jet A. Nothing's going through the jet engines of commercial aircraft. What they showed me were nozzles that were actually fitted on the craft, and they were dumping chemicals straight out of those nozzles into the atmosphere. And they linger, and they form these shady kind of bands across the sky. Why? I have no idea. But you are correct. Somebody's dumping chemicals into the air.
They're all over the place. Now, how are they filling the planes? Are they canisters underneath with nozzles?
The pictures that I've seen, they look like 55-gallon drums in the cargo area of the plane.
Okay, with tubes connected straight to the nozzles that are on the outside of the plane.
Right, they get to a certain altitude and they turn on either from ground control. I don't think the pilots have anything to do with it because I just know too many pilots, and I know a lot of retired pilots. I hang with them, and to their knowledge, nothing like that has ever happened. Yeah. But you can definitely tell the difference between a contrail and a chemtrail.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Brooks, thanks. We'll come back with some Final phone calls with you right here on Coast to Coast AM. Our next program, by the way, Steve Quayle joins us, and he's got all kinds of information about the New World Order. We'll be right back. Brooks, even though you demonstrated this ability to move clouds, are you perfecting that at all, or have you moved on to something?
Yeah, I've moved on. You know, the searching for oil and gas in the ground was, believe me, the mud and the snow and the rain out there in the oil fields is not the place that I wanted to continue my career. The technology, however, is pretty interesting, and it can be safely used. And actually, we're getting to the point now where you could almost use it receive only, which means you don't even have to broadcast a very strong signal, maybe 5 or 10 watts, something very benign. There's plenty of noise, RF noise in the environment that you can use it as your stimulating frequencies and just listen to the ground, and you'll pick up everything you need to know, at least down to around 3,000 feet, which is where most of the oil discoveries on dry land are made anyway.
So let's review HARP for a bit before we go to final call. So initially when it was created, you think it was for a communication device to submarines and other areas, and then eventually...
that was the big sales plan, that it was going to be used to improve secure communications with the submarines, which, you know, are pretty isolated. You can't communicate with them once they're underwater. They have to come to the surface and trail a long antenna behind them to gather information. And getting that information there without it being listened to it was a matter of top security, because we were in a very tense time in the mid-'90s when this was first put together. But the side effects that were discovered from the power and the usefulness of this system is what makes it particularly interesting to them, and I think now the side effects are becoming more interesting than the communication effects.
All right, back to the phones we go. Port Angeles in Washington. Hey, Thomas, go ahead.
Hey, George. Hey, 2 great shows back to back. It's been a real pleasure listening tonight.
Thank you.
There's a massive star on the face of Mars. It's a huge canyon, right? And you were talking about the, what was it? The solar tap, right?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Is that enough energy to do something like that?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, if something like this went off, you're talking about 50 Mount St. Helens per second for about 2 minutes.
Because they never really have figured out where all the dirt went from our own Grand Canyon. And I'm wondering if, like, underneath the pyramids is a good, safe place to be.
Well, yeah, there are lots of safe places to be on the planet if we just manage ourselves a little bit better. I think we're in the 21st century. We need to finally figure out that we're all on this world together, and we need to stop charging across the frozen tundra at one another with battle axes and figure out how to live together.
Brooks, would your device, which you created to look for gas and oil, could it be used, for example, to see if the Hall of Records might be hidden away at the base of the Sphinx?
Yes, absolutely. And some of that technology was used by some Germans in that region, and a void was found. And last year we released some pictures of a shaft that was dug in front of the Sphinx. And I've got pictures of crates that were hauled out of there, and the sandbags and people standing around there. And these are daytime shots, not nighttime shots.
That's pretty exciting. I would love to find out if there's anything there.
Well, I think the world would too, but as we discussed in the first hour, Zawi Hawass is very possessive, and he wants to make sure that Egypt releases these discoveries at its own free will, and we can't fault him for that, I guess.
Part of me, though, believes he already knows what's there, that he might already have been there, pulled it out.
Well, I think so, but the real question is he, locked in like the Archaeological Society of the world is today? They have an ongoing argument with geologists of the world, you well know because of our mutual friend Michael Cremo, who's the forbidden archaeologist. Mm-hmm. I think that I don't know if he has a buy-in like that or not. In fact, I talked to one of his associates the last time I was in Egypt, and I said, do you realize what Zawi could get in tourist dollars if he really revealed conclusive proof that off-worlders were involved in the construction of the pyramids?
It'll be phenomenal, but he won't do that.
Well, we don't know that. We don't know that. There are discussions going on with him as we speak about that.
I asked him a question once, Brooks, about extraterrestrials in the pyramids. He went nuts.
Yeah, he did. How long ago was that? I know exactly what you're talking about.
It's about a year and a half ago, I think.
Well, that's pretty recent, but he is softening. You know, lots of things have changed over there. The last time I was there, these tensions were there between the populace and the ruling class of Egypt. I don't know if you've ever been there, George, but there's no clean drinking water in Cairo. It's just horrible. The trash that's piled in these tributaries from, these canals that come off the Nile. This is where people get their drinking water.
Yeah.
There's no housing. It's a city of 20 million people, and there isn't a traffic light in it. There's just no support from the government at all to the people.
Well, that's why the uprising.
Exactly.
Let's go to Los Angeles. Andrew's turn on Coast to Coast. Hey, Andrew, thank you.
Hey, George, you're a great patriot, and you have a great guest. Yes, I've heard talk about HAARP being used for psychological purposes, like to affect people's emotions and maybe to pacify them. That was one question. Have you heard about that? Also, have you heard about the compressed air car? I believe it is originated out of Belgium, and the Tata Nono company has bought the rights or has their own technology for incorporating battery power and this compressed air. And have you looked into that? And continue your great work, both of you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Answer to both questions. Last one first. Yes, the compressed air car we know about. It's a nice idea, but what they've taken out of the equation is all the energy it takes to compress the air. So it really is not that efficient, and it's kind of hard to get out there and find a compressor with 3,000 psi to put air back in the car so you can drive it. Nice idea, but it just the energy doesn't balance. I wish it did, but it just doesn't. Mind control with HAARP, absolutely. My colleague, Dr. Nick Begich, is well aware of that, has a lot of books out on it, and has done a lot more research than I have. Dr. Patrick Flanagan years ago also did research on that, and it's definitely present, and it definitely has been used in the battlefield.
Okay, back we go. Apple Valley, California. David, you're on Coast to Coast. Hi, Dave.
Hey, George. How are you? Good show.
Okay. All is well. Thanks.
Yeah. I want to ask the guest about these earthquakes. You know, they had 9.0, which was in Indonesia, and then they had the 9.0 up in Tokyo. And these earthquakes, I totally believe these are man-made. These people are doing this. They are really evil people, and they are doing this really because I heard that this is the final closure for Pearl Harbor, for what the Japanese did in Pearl Harbor in 1941, and this is the closure. So they're picking these hits. One, because they want to thin the herd of the population of the planet, and two, because they have a beef with other countries. And does that make any sense?
I don't think you could rule that out, Brooks.
Well, when it comes to this kind of stuff, I guess I have to say I'm not a very good why person. Because when I travel to the world, whether I go to Tibet or China or Japan or Egypt, I don't really see people. I meet individuals, and they don't fall into this class of humans that are expendable in the way that some of the conspiracy theorists spout. And I don't know if I support it or not. I don't know any government or any super government that would want to attrit the human race. I think there are maybe militaries that want one-upmanship over one another. There may be political reasons for doing things to one another, and maybe it's just wars are us hard at work. But when it comes to annihilating masses of civilians, I really have a hard time buying into that. So I'm going to pass on that question.
We've got Austin in Atlanta, Georgia, first-time caller. Hi, Austin. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hey, guys. Great show tonight. You covered a lot of very interesting topics. The past couple of years in Georgia, we've had a lot of droughts and the water wars between, the tri-state area with Tennessee and Alabama and Florida, and Georgia as well. I was wondering, with all the bad things we've covered with HAARP, is there any, way you can actually use HAARP to create clouds, to create rain, to create, an atmosphere that has a lot of water coming out of it, to create drinking water and that type of thing? And you can answer it off air. Thank you.
Good question. Yes. Is there anything good about HAARP?
Yes, absolutely. That is something that is being looked at and has been published, not just in this nation, but other nations. Overhead of us are billions of gallons of water flowing every single day. Learning how to judiciously drop that water out of the air to make fresh water on the surface of the ground would probably be one of the greatest uses of HAARP if it could be done. We've tried seeding clouds. We've tried cloud ships that go out into the ocean and spray water vapor up into the air so that it can evaporate and form clouds. Great technologies trying to be used to put moisture back into the air to the point where it will fall back out of the air as rain and be used to water crops and not flood us out. As I said in the first hour, when we start pumping energy into Mother Nature, she has a way of lashing back out at us in ways that we're not prepared to deal with.
Oh, yes, she sure does. Let's go to Denny now in Milford, Delaware. You're on with Brooks Agnew. Denny, go ahead.
Good morning, gentlemen. This was concerning the lady that called earlier, and you were talking about the, the contrails and the chemtrails.
Yeah.
And every morning, I'm probably maybe 20 miles from the Delaware Bay, and every morning from the northeast to the southwest or from the southwest back to the northeast, all these jets are flying over. And some of them, the contrails will dissipate, and others, the contrails stay there. And one morning in about an hour's period of time, I counted 30 jets going back and forth.
Wow.
And I was just wondering if you could tell me, how you can tell the difference between a contrail and a chemtrail.
Now, that's a tough one, Brooks. It is very difficult to ascertain the difference.
These skyways, which is what the caller is describing, are actually like roads in the sky. These are nav aids that these jets fly when they go from airport to airport, and they pretty much have to stay inside of navigational perusal while they're flying in the Northeast because it's so congested. Different altitudes, different headings, all these jets have to be managed by a massive computer system. So seeing them all in one line is not uncommon. What is uncommon is to see a jet that has a very short contrail behind because the water vapor will very, very quickly go invisible in air that has almost no moisture in it. But a chemtrail is not like that. A chemtrail will linger for hours and will spread and dissipate. That's a big difference. And if a jet's putting out that kind of vapor out of its jet engines, it's not being very efficient in the way it burns fuel.
And we're breathing this stuff, Brooks.
We're breathing it. It's ending up in the soil. We have high aluminum content, which is one of the telltale signs that this is being dropped. It ends up in the soil. It ends up in the plants. We end up ingesting it. There are side effects to these chemicals that are being put into the air and these metals that are being put into the air.
You were talking earlier about the population and mind control and how to bring a soldier down to his knees. Do you think they have these little portable HAARPs where they can just like handheld devices?
They're not handheld, but they mount on the back of Hummers, and they take them into the battlefield. They've got a parabolic dish on them. It's a little eighth wave unit, and they can aim it lateral to the ground, target it right into the battle area, and they do use it.
Could it kill somebody if it was aimed right at their body and just really turned on?
I don't think so. This isn't in the microwave range. It's not enough to
It's not going to cook you.
Yeah, it's not going to influence the molecular vibrations of the human body like microwaves would. It couldn't cook you, but it's definitely could have control over your bowels, your heartbeat, your liver functions. I would hate to see it being used as a lethal weapon. I don't like the idea of it being used as a non-lethal weapon. It's a huge violation of the sovereignty of the human mind.
I'm concerned that these things could be used to control population, and not in terms of manipulating minds, but let's say there's a massive protest because people are ticked at government, right? Legitimately so. Would they flip that on to send everybody down to their knees?
Well, or make everybody forget why they're there, and gee, I think I'm going to go home and watch TV. I'm going to go to the mall and buy a new pair of pants. I don't know. That's a good question, George.
If Mubarak had it, or if Gaddafi had it, they would use it, I bet.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's go next to John in San Leandro, California. Squeeze you in real fast. Go ahead, John.
Oh, hi, George. Great show again.
Hi. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you think China may be the one that used the HARP against Japan. And I'm just curious of why you would rule out the United States. And we're an ally of Japan, and if China did do that, isn't that considered an act of war against us? Are they challenging us? And second question would be I do believe chemtrails are connected to HARP. I believe what they're doing is they're sensitizing every human being to more chemical, or how do I say? They're electrifying our systems with the heavy metals that we're ingesting, which makes us more susceptible to mind control and to other nefarious technologies. And so what do you think about that?
All right, we got to go. 30 seconds. Yes, I think it could be considered an act of aggression if it's used in those kinds of purposes. And Brooks, 15 seconds to go. Wrap it up.
Well, I was just going to say that, follow the money. I don't think the U.S. interest would be served by Japan being subjected to this kind of thing, and maybe other countries would. So that's my thought on the matter. Don't forget to visit the websites. We've got a lot of stuff out there. By the way, special for Coast to Coast listeners, if you buy the book tonight, you get the audio version for free. So if you're not a good reader, don't worry about it. I read it for you.
All right. Remembering the future. Thanks, Brooks. Dan Galante, Tom Danheiser, Lisa Lyon, Lex Lonehood, Sean Laudesor, Stephanie Smith, Ross Mitchell, George Nappy, and Pundit and Art Bell. I'm George Norrie. Somewhere out there on Coast to Coast AM. We'll see you on our next edition. Until then, be safe.
Produced it for Jesse Ventura's first program in his series called Conspiracy Theories. So we did one on weather warfare, and we built a scale model, demonstrated it on TV, and showed people how a cloud could be moved. Now, we didn't have enough time to do the earthquake segment like we did with the History Channel 6 or 7 months before that, but it was still pretty dramatic. It was, 1.7 million viewers that first night of that episode. So, lots of people are aware that this capability is out there.
Why would someone want to manipulate the weather?
Oh, that's a really great question. History is replete with civilizations being delivered by the hand of God, not the least of which is the Spanish Armada being sunk in the English Channel as they were sailing up to attack Britain. I'm sure the British were quite happy that God had stepped in with typically harsh weather in the English Channel and sunk those ships. What a wonderful thing it would be to be able to command the hand of God to just come in and smack your enemy with particularly bad weather. And besides, there are no fingerprints. Surely you must be joking, they would say in the news release. You think we could manipulate the weather? Are you kidding? Bad luck for you. It's the perfect weapon, George. It has no fingerprints. It is an act of God that comes in and directs a hurricane into your path, or starves you out of rain for a couple of years, or causes a summer of heat so bad that your wheat cooks into dust in the middle of the field.
Do you believe that as this technology gets further developed, that governments will use it for very evil purposes?
Well, as I said in the first segment, I'm not much of a believer in anything. I look for evidence, and I can tell you, George, I'm a history buff. I read about it. I studied. I look for trends and patterns. I can almost guarantee that if the capability is there, they will use it, and they will develop it to its most strategic advantage.
Exactly. Talk about the solar tap again for me. What's it?
Wow. Oh, the solar tap. If you go out during a thunderstorm, and we had a doozy here in southern Mississippi today, you'll see thunder clouds form, and everybody's seen these from a distance. The big head goes up 50,000 feet in the air, and the air begins moving up and down, and then it creates a static charge. An ion path will open between the bottom of that cloud and the ground. And as the ion path opens from the ground up to the cloud, it allows electrons to discharge that have built up as static charge in that cloud down to the ground. Now, that lightning bolt's typically only about the size of your arm, but it appears very bright. Of course, as it vaporizes the air in its path and the air comes back together, then you get the clap of thunder. Well, that's a pretty devastating multi-million volt event. But at the end of the day, we're only talking a jump of maybe 2,000 to 5,000 feet to the ground. A solar tap is something quite a bit larger. The ionosphere sits around the Earth like a giant soap bubble. It not only protects us from cosmic radiation like that, we know a big quake's coming, evacuate the city. Truth is, it doesn't happen.
Let's go back to the Roseburg, Oregon situation. Were you in shock when you figured out that you were doing this, or at least participating in it?
Yeah, I was. That day we were on contract, of course, and on a schedule, and everybody has to, feed their families, so we were staying with it. But in retrospect, we were going back and writing up the report. I was a little tenuous at that point. I said, guys, we could have triggered something. Maybe we should be careful in geotechnically active areas, like here in the overthrust area of the Northwest. We should be careful with how much power we're using and how we're directing this. We don't want to trigger anything, and, when they come with the helicopters to find out what happened, here we are in our four-wheel drive van and our little ATV. We're the only culprits. We would be seen as, today, we'd be seen as geological terrorists. So, it's definitely frightening to think of the consequences.
50 watts, it's less than most of my light bulbs.
Well, that's true, but see, that's the beauty of Tesla's resonance theory. It doesn't take very much energy. It just takes exactly the right amount of energy at exactly the right frequency. It constructively interferes with itself, like playing tetherball, or like building upon the same sound wave over and over again, like when you're in a room that you get a standing wave in. That's the beauty of how this works. When you create a wavelength that's exactly the right length, very small amounts of power can be very effective. It's the perfect weapon. Of course they would want to develop it.
And it is so secretive, yet we pick up little bits and pieces as we've been talking about.
Well, and the former governor, he's a great guy. He's imposing. He doesn't take any crap off anybody. When he went up there to the HARP facility, and they would not let him pass that fence for a tour, he was not happy. That was a really tense moment for him. I thought they were going to have to cut the film and get the Band-Aids out because it was going to get rough. He didn't like that one bit. You're exactly right, George. There are secrets behind that fence, and the public knows nothing. There is no civilian oversight of this weapons system, and that's the danger.
How do we know here in the United States that they've turned HARP on in Alaska? Do we have any idea? Are there things we can see?
Well, yes, there are auroras that will happen in very strange places, like as far south as Charlotte. That would not be something ordinary. Maybe down into Wisconsin, but an aurora would not appear in equatorial climes unless it was artificially produced. It has. In Chile, right before the quake. In Haiti, right before the quake. There was the telltale lavender sky that lights up just before these things happen. Now, I published that, and somebody wrote back and said, oh, that's nonsense. Every time there's an earthquake, a major quake, the sky does that because the Earth puts off these frequencies. And I immediately wrote back. I said, you're kidding. This would be amazing. We have the best earthquake detector we could ever ask for. All we have to do is watch the sky. And when it turns lavender, the U.S., Japan was the number 2 buyer of U.S. debt. And we're, of course, wonderful trading partners with Japan. It would have been advantageous to the Chinese because they're the number 1 buyers of U.S. debt. And they're up and coming strong, and they want to compete in several markets, not the least of which is electronics and manufactured goods and pre-manufactured goods. And their HARP is located not very far away, and they are already suspected of targeting Japan, not actually firing them, but targeting them with missiles. So there is intent, there is opportunity, and there is capability. Those are 3 good earmarks for any investigator. Russia, on the other hand, also has some motivation to do it because they are not really the friends that the Clintons would have us believe they are with the West. The West, however, probably was not involved in it. Now, the other HARPs do have signatures as well. The one in Russia is nicknamed the Woodpecker because its ELF is so high amplitude that it makes a very loud ticking sound on the ham radio when it's picked up. No evidence that that one was picked up.
Huh.
So that only leaves the Chinese one left.
And I'm also told, Brooks, that the one in Alaska is no longer owned by us. It's owned by some other company outside of the United States. Is that true?
I'm not aware of that. I really am not. The government does some strange things with its assets and moves them around. When we built a scale model of the HARP cloud chamber, and I actually